Former Alliance negotiator Marcus Webb lived in a remote cabin on the frontier colony world of Haven's Edge, deliberately isolated, deliberately disconnected from the diplomatic work that had consumed 15 years of his life before he walked away from it entirely 3 years ago. He'd chosen this particular location specifically because storms were frequent and dangerous here, requiring genuine self-sufficiency, naturally discouraging casual visitors, providing the solitude he'd been actively seeking. Tonight's storm was particularly violent, the kind that made even experienced colonists immediately take shelter and wait it out rather than risking exposure to the brutal wind and driving rain. Marcus was secure inside his reinforced cabin, watching the storm through protected windows with the detached interest of someone who's weathered many such storms safely. When he noticed a figure struggling through the wind and rain toward his shelter, someone caught outside when the storm intensified, desperately seeking refuge before the weather became lethal. He opened the reinforced door without hesitation. You didn't leave people to die in these storms regardless of your personal desire for isolation or privacy. The figure stumbled inside, completely soaked and clearly exhausted from fighting the wind. Marcus was already reaching for emergency blankets and towels when the figure turned toward him, removing the hood that had been shielding her face from the violent wind. She was Velthari, tall, elegant even while soaked and exhausted, with the distinctive long ears characteristic of her species. And she stopped absolutely cold when she saw his face clearly, her expression shifting rapidly from relief to shock to something that looked almost like horror. "Marcus?" Her voice was barely a whisper, nearly lost beneath the sound of the storm still raging outside. Marcus froze as well, recognizing her immediately despite 3 years of separation and the very different circumstances of this meeting. Lissa, Dr. Lissa Venteller. Velthari cultural liaison he'd worked closely with for 5 years during his time with the Alliance Diplomatic Corps. Colleague, trusted friend, and for one complicated year, something substantially more than friends before everything had fallen apart spectacularly and he'd left the diplomatic service entirely. They stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. Outside, the violent storm continued to rage. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one made of unresolved history, painful memories, and questions neither had adequately answered in 3 years of deliberate separation. "What are you doing here?" Lissa asked, her voice carefully controlled, but Marcus could hear the emotional turbulence beneath the surface composure. "I live here, have for 3 years. What are you doing on Haven's Edge?" "Diplomatic mission to the colony administration. My transport was significantly delayed by the storm system. I was attempting to reach the colony administrative center when the weather turned substantially worse than predicted. Your cabin was the only shelter I could reach before conditions became lethal." She was still standing just inside the door, water dripping from her clothes, clearly torn between staying in a storm that could genuinely kill her and staying in a cabin with someone she obviously hadn't wanted to see again. "You need to get out of those wet clothes immediately before hypothermia becomes a serious risk," Marcus said, forcing himself into practical problem-solving mode rather than dealing with the emotional complexity of this situation. "I have spare clothes that will be far too large but significantly better than freezing. Bathroom is there. I'll prepare something hot to drink." "Marcus, we can talk after you're not at immediate risk of hypothermia from exposure. The storm is going to last several more hours at minimum. You're stuck here regardless of our history." Lissa reluctantly accepted the practical necessity, took the clothes he offered without further argument, disappeared into the small bathroom. Marcus used those few minutes alone to process what was actually happening. Of all the people who could have sought emergency shelter at his deliberately isolated cabin during a dangerous storm, it was Lissa. The person he'd worked closely with for 5 years, cared about deeply, had a complicated relationship with that had ended badly when his growing disillusionment with diplomatic work collided sharply with her deep commitment to it. The person he'd essentially left behind when he'd walked away from everything he'd built in the Alliance Diplomatic Corps. When she emerged, dressed in his oversized clothes, hair still damp but no longer soaked through, they sat in his small living area with hot drinks, the storm continuing to rage outside, both acutely aware they were effectively trapped here together until it passed. "I didn't know you'd left Earth entirely," Lissa said finally, breaking the tense silence. "I thought you'd simply left diplomatic service, not gone to some remote frontier colony. I needed complete change, not just different work, entirely different life. This colony is as far from alliance politics and diplomatic complexity as I could physically get. You just disappeared without explanation. One day you were there, the next day your resignation was filed and you were gone. No real explanation, no goodbye to anyone, nothing. I left formal explanation, filed official resignation, with my reasons clearly documented in required paperwork. A formal bureaucratic document isn't genuine explanation to people who cared about you. To me, the unspoken tension that had been building finally broke through the surface. You want to know why I left? You were there, Lissa. You saw what I saw, 5 years of intensive negotiations where nothing fundamentally changed, where we constantly rearranged words in formal agreements while underlying systemic problems persisted unchanged, where diplomacy meant making everyone feel heard and validated while actually accomplishing nothing substantive. I was exhausted from pretending that endlessly shuffling words around in documents actually mattered. That's not fair to the work we did. We accomplished real, meaningful things, trade agreements that genuinely improved people's lives, cultural exchange programs that built authentic understanding between species. We accomplished careful compromises that ultimately satisfied no one and changed nothing fundamental about underlying problems. And worse, we all pretended those minor compromises were significant victories. I couldn't keep doing that, couldn't keep actively participating in elaborate performance where everyone pretends incremental nothing is meaningful progress. So you just left without discussion, walked away from work that genuinely mattered to many people, from people who, she stopped abruptly, but Marcus knew exactly what she hadn't said. From people who cared about you, from me. I left because I was burning out trying to pretend I still believed in work I'd stopped finding meaningful. And yes, I left you as well. Because you are so deeply committed to that work, so absolutely certain it matters, and I couldn't keep pretending I agreed while we were. Whatever we were becoming to each other. We were becoming partners, Lissa said quietly but firmly. Professional partners, personal partners. And you left without giving me any opportunity to understand your perspective or respond to your decision or work through it together. What would you have said if I'd stayed for that conversation? Stay and keep doing work you find meaningless because I care about you. That wouldn't have been fair to either of us. I would have said I loved you and wanted to figure it out together, instead of you deciding unilaterally that our philosophical differences were completely insurmountable without even discussing it with me. The words hung heavy in the air between them. The storm continued to rage outside, but the real storm was happening inside now, 3 years of unspoken hurt and completely unresolved feelings finally being directly confronted. They sat in heavy silence for a long time, the weight of what Lissa had just admitted settling between them like a physical presence. "I didn't know you felt that way," Marcus said finally, his voice quiet. "You never explicitly said. Because you were already pulling away emotionally, already deeply disillusioned and increasingly distant. I could feel you leaving emotionally long before you actually left physically. What was I supposed to do? Confess deep feelings to someone who was clearly deciding our shared work, and possibly our relationship wasn't worth his continued commitment? I was burning out completely, Lissa. Not just with the diplomatic work, but with everything surrounding it. I couldn't give you what you genuinely deserved when I couldn't even figure out what I wanted for my own life anymore. Leaving seemed kinder than staying, and gradually resenting everything, including eventually you. You don't get to unilaterally decide what's kinder for me. You should have talked to me directly, told me honestly what you were feeling, given me a chance to be part of the decision instead of just disappearing without real explanation. You're absolutely right. I should have done that. I was a coward about the whole situation. It was easier to just leave than to have an extremely difficult conversation about how broken and disillusioned I felt about everything. The storm was beginning to ease noticeably outside. Dawn was gradually approaching. Soon Lissa would be able to leave safely, return to her diplomatic mission, and they would probably never encounter each other again. "What if I stayed?" Lissa said suddenly. "Not tonight, obviously, but after my current diplomatic mission is complete. Came back here and we talked properly about what actually happened 3 years ago and what we both genuinely want now instead of what we wanted then. You love diplomatic work deeply. You're committed to it in ways I never was and never will be again. What exactly would you be staying for? To see if there's still something genuine here worth exploring together. To see if the person I loved 3 years ago is still somewhere in there under all the isolation and disillusionment. To actually have the honest conversation we absolutely should have had before you left. Marcus considered carefully. 3 years of deliberate isolation had given him substantial clarity about what he definitely didn't want. He didn't want to return to diplomatic work, didn't want the complexity and performance and endless compromise that had burned him out. But seeing Lissa again, finally having this direct confrontation about their past, had made him realize what he did genuinely want. Honesty in relationships, meaningful connection with someone who mattered, willingness to actually communicate openly instead of running from difficult conversations. I'm not coming back to diplomatic work under any circumstances. That's completely non-negotiable for me. I'm not asking you to return to that work. I'm asking if you'd be willing to explore whether we can build something meaningful together that doesn't require either of us to fundamentally abandon who we are. How would that even work practically? Your work is there in alliance space. My entire life is here now on this frontier colony. I honestly don't know yet. But we could figure it out together instead of you deciding unilaterally that it's impossible before we even try. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt something that wasn't resignation or deliberate isolation. He felt genuine possibility. Lissa did return to Haven's Edge after her diplomatic mission completed successfully. Not permanently at first. They both needed substantial time to actually know each other again, to understand who they'd each become during 3 years of separation. She visited between her various diplomatic missions. They talked extensively, really talked with genuine honesty, about what had gone wrong 3 years ago, what they both genuinely wanted now, how to potentially build something together that respected both her deep commitment to her work and his need for a fundamentally different kind of life. Eventually, they found an arrangement that wasn't really compromise in the negative sense. She maintained her diplomatic career and commitments, but established Haven's Edge as her permanent base between missions. He maintained his deliberately isolated lifestyle, but opened it enough to genuinely let her into his life. They built something together that neither had expected, but both discovered they needed. Years later, when people asked about how they had found their way back to each other after 3 years of separation, Lissa told the story honestly. I was desperately fleeing a dangerous storm, sought emergency shelter at what I thought was a random isolated cabin, and stopped completely cold when I saw him. The man I'd loved and lost 3 years earlier without any real closure. What should have been simple emergency shelter became an unavoidable confrontation about our unresolved history and all the things we'd never properly said to each other. We finally had the honest conversation we absolutely should have had 3 years earlier, admitted feelings and truths we'd been too afraid to say at the time, and decided to try again with genuine honesty instead of assumptions about what the other